Welcome everyone, they call me IntroTechOut, and lighting, along with sound effects and music, has a huge influence on the atmosphere in any given scene, but is often overlooked. The difference between an unlit and a well-lit scene can be quite literally night and day. That is why, today I wanted to do a quick lighting tutorial / tips and tricks video for indoor scenes. Before I go into it though, I did get some pushback last time with my last lighting tutorial, and I mean it was understandable. The end result was really light and really bright, and I can see how it was just a tiny bit overkill. Still, I stand by most of my recommendations in that video. I've now a couple of times tried the exact same lighting method on other scenes, with exception of maybe upping the brightness in the grid and effects tool, and it has always looked great in my opinion. I also saw a lot of concern about me maxing out a lot of the sliders, because that's what I did. I made the sun brightness 100% and the sky brightness nearly the same, and I maxed out all other kinds of things as well. That is because what Dreams calls 100% wouldn't even be called 5% in other programs. For example, if you legitimately max out the brightness of the sun in a program like Blender, the whole scene will just be pure uniform bright white, burning your eyes like an LBP loading screen in the evening. In one of my first Dreams videos I talked about lighting in my cyberpunk apartment, and there I showed the difference between using the actual sun for outside light coming in and using fake spotlights to create the same effect. You can see quite clearly that 100% sun brightness is not nearly as bright as it could be. But I think I've made my point now, so it's time to move on. Because like I said earlier, this video will be focusing on indoor areas. For this video I'll take the scene called Warm Bedroom by Bromskop, and I'll be showing how to light it as if it were a nighttime scene, a daytime scene and a daytime scene with cloudy weather. As a bonus, I will at the end of the video also talk about the lighting in the pool area of my Arena of Disco Dream. Let's get into it. And let's start with nighttime. The holidays are coming up after all, and wouldn't we all like to create some cozy winter scenes with Christmas trees and lots of lights? Well, I do. So where to begin? It's probably smartest to, again, start with the sun and sky gadget. First thing we should do is to make the sun invisible. I've said this in my last video as well, but the sun in Dreams doesn't look like the sun, which makes it immersion breaking in pretty much any scene except for really stylized ones. The second reason? It's nighttime, so there is no sun. As far as the sun brightness goes, we can repurpose it as moonlight, but that's a stylistic choice. Games and other entertainment generally like to hugely exaggerate the amount of light that comes from the moon, which anyone who's ever spent a night in the woods can attest to. In real life, the moon does almost nothing for lighting at nighttime, but of course this is your world now, so if you like the look of it, absolutely go for it. Do remember to make it the color white. Yellowish light tends to look a bit dull, and last time I checked, the scientific consensus is that the moon is not made out of cheese. This brings us to the next page of this gadget, the sky. Pretty obvious, but we're going to drop the brightness to 0. Because all objects in Dreams seem to be slightly transparent to the sky, this will make shadows completely black, resulting in a scene that immediately feels like it has a lot more depth to it. Most of the other settings on this page are now completely redundant, but fog range is still interesting. Because as a rule, I'd say that fog range should be pushed to its maximum pretty much always. But there is one exception, and that is nighttime. The reason is that because the sky is now uniformly black, individual flecks can no longer be recognized. This in turn means that this fog now looks like actual fog, instead of it making things look transparent. For indoor scenes, having a lot of fog doesn't make sense of course, but do keep this in mind for outdoor scenes, or if you're creating, for example, a horror game with really long hallways. For now, let's bump up the fog range to the usual 10,000 meters. With the sun and sky gadget done, we could move on to the grid and effects tool, but since we're now in an indoor scene, I think we should first talk about some object-based lighting instead of global lighting. Now this scene already contains a lot of lights, and I added a Christmas tree for good measure, but trust me, you really can't have enough lights in your scene. Dreams after all can handle large amounts of lights extremely well, as long as they don't cast shadows. But before adding more lights, let's first walk through the scene and see if everything works. It looks pretty good, but... huh? Do you see that? There's some weird effect going on at the edges of the screen, as if the lights are only turned on when you look at them. What happens if we look down? Wow, all light seems to disappear. When I first saw this, it confused me a bit, because I've worked with a lot of lights on my previous ventures and I've never encountered this effect. The reason it turns out is because I've only ever used sculpts and lights for lighting, not paint. What you're seeing here is caused by the candles on the walls. The creator made the flames, which are painted, emit light. I don't know why, but when off-screen, Dreams doesn't seem to render these anymore, which means the light from the fire now disappears. The easiest way to fix this is probably to just tweak the flames and set them so they don't emit light onto the scene. Then just fake the light with the light gadget and we're done. If you want to add the slight flickering effect we're now missing, you could probably just animate the light with one of the animation gadgets. But so far that, let's add some more lights. But as sculpts. Now I really have no rule for adding little lights to scenes. The only thing I'll say is that I usually make them bright to the exact point where their core turns white. If you like that look too, I will recommend to let the tint amount slider of sculpts stay at 100%, because if you push it all the way to 200%, the object in question will become a uniform color. Now we're on the topic of lights, let's also add a spotlight to the chandelier, making it look as if it's spreading light around the room. Here's where we come across a really underused feature of spotlights, and that's that you can give these lights images to project. These can look breathtakingly beautiful if used correctly. I think these can be used to great effect in nature scenes, but in some particular cases, like the chandelier, you can also use them to great effect indoors. Do keep in mind with spotlights that Dreams can handle only like 6 to 10 of these at a time if they cast shadows. If you plan on using a lot of shadow casting lights in your scene, try to activate the cast shadow feature only for the area where the player is currently walking around. You can do this by utilizing trigger zones with keyframes attached. But with the beautiful lights done, let's move on to the post-processing with a Gradient Effects tool. Now this is not necessary, and I might go a bit too far again, but the Gradient Effects tool can be a really handy tool to create the exact atmosphere you're looking for. There is no right answer here for the exact settings you should use. Just experiment until you find something you like. Here's what I would do for this particular scene. First, let's up the brightness a bit. In a room with as many lights as this one, you would be able to see everything in real life, so let's make sure that's the case here too. I usually only use the contrast slider to make the shadows slightly darker, but in this case they're already completely black, so we can skip that slider. The saturation is also not something I will use for now, but you can always play with it after you've done all the other changes. Now we get to a real subjective part. On the next page of the Gradient Effects tool, you can change the color of shadows, midtones and highlights. I like how the scene looks right now, but I do think I could make it feel a lot warmer than it currently does. The way you do this is by changing the color of the shadows to a more reddish color. Also, the higher you go in the color picker, the lighter the scene will feel, so because I still want it to be slightly lighter, I'll pick a lighter color. On the third page of the Gradient Effects tool, I will first add some more bloom. This will add a glow effect to any lights we have in the scene, almost as if there is some sort of mist around them. Bloom is not something I can recommend for every scene, but for these Christmas type scenes that are meant to make you feel warm and cozy, I like it a lot. With lens flare you can honestly do what you want. I'll let it stay at its current setting, but I don't blame you if you put it to 0% because we currently do have a lot of lights in the scene. Just like last time though, I will set the blurriness to -100 because I like the more crisp look. I will also set the motion blur to 0 because I hate it, but it's up to you to use it. And with that we're pretty much done with the nighttime version of the scene. Only thing I will do now is add in the moon for good measure. I'll just take one from the Dreamiverse. But let's move on to daytime now. Time for a new Sun and Sky gadget and Gradient Effects tool. Now the first thing you might expect me to say is to turn up the sun brightness to 100% again. No actually, for indoor scenes I keep the sun out of it altogether because it's not nearly bright enough to create realistic light. So instead, we'll just like the cyberpunk apartment I made, add some spotlights outside to act as the sun. Keep in mind that you will need a unique light for every window because we want shadows to be parallel instead of diverging. How bright these lights should be? Up to you, but I'll max them out to 1000%. Now we can move on to the Sun and Sky gadget again. On the Sky page, I'll, just like last lighting video, set the flex type to 4, the sky brightness to nearly 100% and desaturate the whole thing slightly. Next I'll make the sky a light blue, remove the horizon definition and set the fog distance to its usual 10,000 meters. For the gradient effects, I'll slightly reduce the brightness of the scene and add some contrast for deeper shadows. More than 15% is really not necessary. Once again, it's best to mess with saturation after the rest of the scene is completed. As for the shadows, midtones and highlights, right now I want the scene to feel cooler instead of warm. This means I'll set the midtones and shadows to a slight bluish color. If you want your game to look like a heavily filtered fantasy scene, you can bump up the bloom slider again, but if you don't, just keep it the way it is. The rest of the settings, lens flare, sharpen and motion blur are once again really subjective, so do whatever you like. I'll again set the blurriness and motion blur to the lowest possible. This brings us to the next scenario, an overcast day. For this I'll just clone the gadgets we've just tweaked and make a couple changes. First we of course should turn off the spotlights because the sun is no longer shining in through the window. First thing we should do in the Sun and Sky gadget is to make the sky white. The brightness of the sky you can set to anything between 10 and 80% really, because the thickness of the cloud deck is not always the same. On some days it genuinely hurts your eyes to look at a cloudy sky, but on others it doesn't at all. For the gradient effects, you can let the settings stay exactly the same as the sunny day, except that I recommend to remove the blue tint. And that's pretty much it as far as this scene is concerned. One more thing though, before I'll talk about Arena of Disco. When we lay all these scenes we've just created next to each other, it's kind of obvious that the nighttime one looks the best by a pretty big margin. I think it's genuinely easier to create something good looking at nighttime than at daytime in Dreams, at least for indoor scenes. The reason, I'm no expert, but I would guess it has something to do with the contrast between light and dark. The nighttime scene has some really nice interplay between all the bright little lights and the surrounding shadows, making for an all-around pleasing picture. The sunny scene has this to a lesser extent, where only the sunlight reflecting on the floor creates a nice contrast with the rest of the scene. The overcast scene, however, has no real bright or dark spots, making the whole thing seem kinda boring. The lesson here? Well, don't set your game on an overcast day if possible. This brings me to my Arena of Disco dream. A first-person shooter set in a dark void, but with tons of neon lights everywhere. If I deactivate preview invisibility in the pool area, you can see that I had a crazy amount of lights in here. Basically, I first wanted to create this weird light pattern by cloning the crap out of a glowing cylinder, but I didn't like the way the thing itself looked, so I made it invisible. I did make it still emit light when invisible, which almost makes it look like the fog in the scene is being lit up by all the lights. Talking about fog, you might have noticed, but I placed a fog gadget near the ground, to almost make it look like water vapor is coming from the pools and waterfall. Using fog is smart in general if you want lights to play with the all-around atmosphere a bit more. And by the way, all those lights is what I meant by saying that Dreams handles non-shadow emitting lights pretty well. In this small part of the scene there must be about 100 lights easily, all blending and interplaying to create the final look, and Dreams handles it like it's nothing. I think that's pretty impressive, honestly. Also, even though I've been covering the Gradient Effects tool pretty heavily this video, this area actually doesn't use one, and the same counts for all my other games. The reason is that my FPS template uses its own Gradient Effects tools for specific effects, which will override the look of the scene upon activation. If you also use my FPS template or have a character that uses Gradient Effects during gameplay, don't also use one for the scene because there's a big chance it won't look good. One last thing before I end this video. Color. What colors should you use when creating scenes with a lot of color? Well, I believe the rule of thumb is that colors on the opposite side of the color wheel cause the most contrast, so red and green, orange and blue, and purple and yellow will be these opposites. But because pink and blue are really common for neon signs and I like the look, I like to use those two colors for my stuff. Also, for some reason blue and pink make for this almost dreamlike atmosphere, which is, I presume, the reason why blue and pink are also tied so heavily to the identity of Dreams. Just watch any Dreams trailer. I swear you'll see these colors everywhere. But that covers pretty much everything I wanted to cover this video, so for now I'll thank you very much for watching and I'll see you around.